Thrown out at 30 below, a mother and daughter found a collapsed root cellar. Gunnar Holmvik, who survived 11 Montana winters and buried a wife and 2 sons, told her, "You will freeze in that hole. Your daughter, too." She had $7, one daughter, and needed 5 cords she couldn't cut. On January 9th, 1887, the temperature dropped 50 degrees in 4 hours. But 5 months earlier, Marta Kjellstad had never built anything larger than a chicken coop in her life. In August of 1886, Marta stood at the edge of a mining town called Elkhorn, with $7 in her pocket and her daughter's hand in hers. Behind them, the company housing they had called home for 3 years. Ahead of them, 30 miles of open territory and no place to go. Her husband Eric had been dead for 6 weeks. A mine collapse. 3 men buried under timber and rock. The company paid for the funeral, but not the debts. Eric had owed $43 to the company store, tools purchased on credit, flour and salt bought against future wages, a wool coat for Britta that he had promised to pay off by Christmas. The debt transferred to Marta the moment Eric stopped breathing. Orrin Thatcher, the mine foreman, had delivered the eviction notice himself, a Vermont man with a thin mouth and thinner patience for immigrants. He had given her 72 hours. Vacate or face arrest. The company needed the housing for workers who could actually work. Marta had asked about Eric's back wages. Thatcher had laughed. "The wages covered the burial," he said. "She should be grateful." She was not grateful, but she was leaving. Britta was 9 years old, small for her age, with her father's pale eyes and her mother's silence. She had not cried at the funeral. She had not cried when they packed the trunk. She held her mother's hand now and watched the road ahead as if it might tell her something useful. The road told them nothing. It simply stretched northeast toward Townsend, 30 miles away, where Marta knew no one and had no prospects. They walked 2 days, 30 miles. $7 that became 6 after buying bread in a town whose name Marta never learned. Britta's feet blistered through her worn boots. Marta carried her the last 3 miles, the trunk abandoned beside the road because she could not carry both. They stopped at the edge of a formation the locals called the Limestone Hills, 16 square miles of rolling terrain shot through with exposed rock, 8 miles southwest of Townsend. There, on a slope facing south, they found what remained of someone else's failed dream, a soddy with its roof collapsed inward, a well with a broken windlass, a root cellar dug into the hillside, its timber frame caved in, half filled with dirt and debris and 3 years of accumulated failure. Marta stood at the edge of the root cellar and looked down into the hole, 12 feet across, 8 feet deep. Dirt walls that had not quite collapsed, the smell of earth and rot and abandonment. This was not a home. It was a grave waiting to be filled. Britta asked if they were going to sleep there. Marta said she did not know yet. The calendar said mid-August. The calendar was a death sentence Marta could read clearly. First frost would come in late September, 6 weeks away. First killing freeze by late October. Full winter by mid-November, when temperatures would drop to 20 below zero and stay there for months. Marta had grown up in Trondheim, Norway. She knew cold. She knew what it did to people who were not ready for it. She had seen frozen bodies carried down from the mountains, their skin the color of old candles. Montana cold was different. It came faster, it stayed longer, and it killed people who thought they knew what cold meant. To survive winter, Marta needed shelter. The soddy was beyond repair. Its walls had dissolved into the prairie, leaving nothing but a rectangular depression filled with rotted sod. Building a new cabin required timber, nails, time, and strength. She had none of these things. She had a hand axe, a shovel, a cast iron pot, $6, and a daughter who needed to be fed, clothed, and kept warm for the next 7 months. The mathematics of survival were simple and merciless. A cabin of the size she could build, 12 feet by 14 feet, small enough for one woman to raise, would require 5 to 6 cords of firewood to survive winter. In severe cold, consumption could reach 7 or 8 cords. A cord of wood weighed 2,000 pounds. 8 cords meant 16,000 pounds of timber that had to be felled, limbed, sectioned, split, hauled, and stacked. Marta could cut perhaps a quarter cord per day if she worked from dawn until dark. 6 cords would take 24 days of brutal labor, assuming she had a cabin to work from, food to sustain the effort, and someone to watch Britta while she swung the axe. She had none of these things. She had 6 weeks until frost and an empty hole in the ground. Gunnar Holmvik found her 3 days later. He was a Norwegian immigrant like Marta, settled in the Missouri Valley since 1873. 61 years old, hands like weathered oak. He had been checking his cattle range when he saw smoke rising from the abandoned homestead, Marta's small fire, burning scraps of the collapsed soddy for warmth. He rode down to investigate. He found a woman and a child sitting beside a hole in the ground, eating cornmeal mush from a cast iron pot. Holmvik had survived 11 Montana winters. He had built 4 cabins with his own hands. In 1879, his first wife and 2 infant sons had frozen to death when a blizzard caught them traveling between homesteads. He had found them sitting upright in the wagon, ice crystals on their eyelashes, his youngest boy still clutched against his mother's chest. He knew exactly what he was looking at when he looked at Marta and Britta. He dismounted. He walked to the edge of the root cellar. He looked down at the collapsed timbers, the dirt walls, the debris. Then he looked at Marta. "You cannot stay here," he said. His Norwegian accent had faded over 13 years, but it thickened when he was angry or afraid. It was thick now. Marta said nothing. "A woman cannot fell timber fast enough," Holmvik continued. "You need 5 cords minimum, 6 to be safe. You cannot cut that much before the freeze." Marta asked what he suggested she do instead. "Take the girl to the church in Townsend. They will find her a family." He paused. "You cannot keep her alive here." Britta looked up from her cornmeal mush. She did not speak. She watched Holmvik with her father's pale eyes, waiting to hear what her mother would say. Marta said she was not giving her daughter away. Holmvik shook his head. He had seen this before. The desperation that looked like determination. The refusal that looked like strength. He had learned that you could not save people who would not be saved. "You will freeze in that hole," he said, "and you will take your daughter with you." He mounted his horse. He rode away. He did not look back. Marta watched him go. Then she looked down into the root cellar, the collapsed timbers, the dirt walls, the smell of earth and rot. Gunnar Holmvik was right. The mathematics were impossible. A woman alone could not cut enough wood to heat a cabin through a Montana winter. But Marta was not thinking about cabins anymore. She was thinking about the cellar. 3 days after Holmvik's visit, Marta climbed down into the collapsed root cellar. Her intention was simple: salvage the rotted timbers for firewood. Every scrap of fuel mattered. The beams were damp and half decayed, but they would burn eventually. The morning air above ground was cool, perhaps 55 degrees. The last gasp of summer before autumn turned sharp. But 8 feet down, at the bottom of the cellar, the air felt different, warmer, steadier, like the temperature had forgotten to change with the season. Marta stopped. She pressed her palm against the exposed dirt wall. The earth was not cold. It was not warm. It simply was. A constant, moderate presence that did not shift with the wind or the clouds or the time of day. She remembered her grandmother's root cellar in Trondheim, how it stayed cool in summer when the coastal heat pressed down, how it stayed warm in winter when ice formed on the harbor. Her grandmother had called it the earth's breath, steady and unchanging, like the heartbeat of something too large to notice the seasons. Marta had never thought about why. She thought about it now. Britta called down from the rim of the cellar, asking what her mother was doing. Marta said she was thinking. The logic assembled itself slowly, like stones stacking into a wall. The earth held warmth. Not much, perhaps 45 or 50 degrees, but it held that warmth constantly, regardless of what happened on the surface. Root cellars worked because of this. Food did not freeze underground, even when the air above turned to ice. If the earth provided 50 degrees on its own, Marta would not need to heat the air from zero. She would only need to raise it from 50 to something livable, 60 or 65 degrees. That was a difference of 15 degrees, not 60. 15 degrees of heating required far less wood than 60, perhaps a quarter as much, perhaps less. Marta looked at the collapsed root cellar with new eyes. The hole was already dug. The walls were already standing, dirt and exposed limestone, solid after 3 years of settling. Only the roof had failed, and the roof was the smallest part of the structure. She could expand the cellar, dig deeper into the hillside, creating a room instead of a storage pit. Line the walls with the limestone that jutted from the hill in exposed seams. Stone did not rot, did not burn, did not collapse. Build a small roof with salvaged timbers, covered with sod and earth for insulation. Install a stove. A small one, big enough to raise the temperature 15 degrees instead of 60. Vent it through a chimney made of clay. She had seen clay pipe chimneys in Norwegian farmhouses, formed and fired by farmers who could not afford iron. If the earth truly held its warmth, she would need 1 or 2 cords of firewood instead of 6. That was 48 days of cutting instead of 24. That was possible. If she was wrong, she would have wasted weeks building something useless, and she and Britta would freeze in a hole in the ground just as Gunnar Holmvik had predicted. Marta climbed out of the cellar. She stood at the rim looking down at the collapsed timbers and debris. 6 weeks until frost, 30 miles from anyone who cared if she lived or died. She could try to build a cabin she could not heat, or she could try to build something no one had ever told her was possible. Either way, she would probably die. At least this way she would die trying something new. Ingi Baka found Marta 2 weeks later, hauling limestone from an outcrop 200 yards from the cellar. Inga was Swedish, not Norwegian, but the difference mattered less in Montana than it had in the old country. She was a widow in her 50s who had lost her husband to fever 3 years before and survived alone through shrewd trading and relentless work. Her homestead sat 4 miles from the abandoned property, close enough to notice activity, far enough to ignore it until curiosity won. She had heard about the Norwegian widow digging in the limestone hills. She had come to see for herself. What she found was Marta covered in dirt and limestone dust, her hands blistered and bleeding, dragging a flat stone the size of a dinner table across the prairie. Inga watched for a moment, then she dismounted and walked over. "What are you building?" she asked. Marta explained. The expanded cellar, the limestone walls, the earth's warmth, the mathematics of heating 15 degrees instead of 60. Inga listened without expression. When Marta finished, Inga looked at the cellar, looked at the limestone, looked at Marta's bleeding hands. "You are digging a grave," Inga said. "That is what this looks like." Marta said she was aware of the resemblance. Stone takes time. You do not have time. Inga pointed at the sky, where the first yellow leaves were appearing on the distant aspens. 6 weeks, maybe 5. Marta said she knew. If water seeps in, you will die in mud. The spring melt will drown you. Marta explained the drainage channel she planned to dig, sloping away from the entrance. If smoke does not vent, you will die in your sleep, carbon monoxide. You will not even wake. Marta described the dual ventilation system, low intake, high exhaust, the chimney creating draft to pull fresh air through. Inge studied her. The blisters, the determination, the daughter sitting on a rock nearby sorting flat limestone pieces into piles by size. "You have thought about this," Inga said. It was not a question. Marta said she had thought about nothing else for 2 weeks. Inga was silent for a long moment. She looked at the cellar, at the limestone outcrop, at the sky. "If you live through November," she said finally, "I will give you half a smoked ham." Marta said she would hold her to it. Inge mounted her horse and rode away. She did not offer to help, but she also did not tell Marta to stop. That was something. Orr and Thatcher arrived in early September, riding out from Elkhorn with a company surveyor. The abandoned homestead had been company property once, before the original claim failed. Thatcher wanted to confirm the land was clear so he could record it as available for company use, grazing, timber rights, whatever the company decided was profitable. He had expected to find nothing. An empty hole, maybe a pile of bones by spring, something he could report to the company and forget. Instead, he found Marta Kjellstad chest deep in limestone, building walls. He dismounted and walked to the rim of the cellar. Britta was inside, hauling a bucket of dirt up an improvised ramp. She froze when she saw Thatcher, recognizing him as the man who had sent them away. Marta climbed out of the cellar to meet him. Her hands were wrapped in rags to protect the blisters. Her dress was brown with dust and dirt. She had lost weight since August, 10 pounds, maybe more, and it showed in her cheeks and the hollows of her eyes. Thatcher looked at her, looked at the cellar, looked at the surveyor, who was already sketching notes. "This land is not yours," Thatcher said. "The original claim was abandoned." Marta said she was aware of that. She was filing a new claim. Under Montana territorial law, she could claim abandoned land if she improved it. She was improving it. Thatcher's thin mouth went thinner. "You are trespassing on company property." Marta replied that the company had held no claim on this land for 3 years. The territorial records were clear. She had checked. This was true. She had walked to Townsend specifically to examine the records. The trip had cost her a day of work, but it had been worth it. Thatcher looked at the surveyor. The surveyor shrugged. The records were indeed clear. "I could have you arrested," Thatcher said. "I could have the girls sent to an orphan train." Marta said nothing. She waited. Thatcher stepped closer. He was taller than her by 6 inches, broader by 50 pounds. He used his size deliberately, crowding her space. "You are digging your own grave," he said. "The company will have this land by spring when we scrape your bones out of that hole." Marta did not step back. She met his eyes. "No judge in Montana will grant a claim to a woman living in a dirt pit," Thatcher continued. "You are wasting your time. And when you die, the company will have to pay to bury you. That will come out of whatever wages Eric left behind." Eric had left no wages. Thatcher knew that. This was cruelty for its own sake. Marta said nothing. Thatcher turned and walked back to his horse. The surveyor followed, still scribbling notes. "By spring," Thatcher called back, "we will scrape your bones out by spring." He rode away. Britta climbed out of the cellar. She stood beside her mother, watching Thatcher disappear over the rise. "Will he come back?" Britta asked. Marta said probably. "Will he send us to an orphan train?" Marta looked down at her daughter. 9 years old, her father's eyes, her mother's silence. "No," Marta said, "he will not." She did not know if this was true, but she knew she would die before she let anyone take Britta away. She picked up her shovel and climbed back into the cellar. The construction numbers piled up like stones. Excavation, 18 days. 8 to 10 hours per day, Marta swinging a pick mattock to loosen the earth, loading it into buckets, hauling it up the ramp to the spoil pile. Britta helped, small loads, light buckets, her thin arms straining against dirt that weighed more than she did. The final dimensions: 12 feet deep into the hillside, 14 feet wide, 7 feet from floor to ceiling. Limestone quarrying, endless. Marta found a seam 200 yards from the cellar where the stones split along natural fractures. She drove iron wedges with a sledgehammer, breaking slabs into manageable pieces, 40 to 60 pounds each. She hauled them by hand. One trip, one stone, 200 yards. Repeat. 600 stones by the time the walls were finished. Wall construction, 22 days. Dry stack technique, 2 rows of stones with tie stones spanning both faces, the walls battering inward at 1 inch per foot of height. 20 inches thick at the base, tapering to 16 at the ceiling. No mortar for most of it, though Marta burned limestone scraps to make quickite for the final ceiling. Her hands turned into something she did not recognize. Blisters that broke and bled, then calloused over, then cracked and bled again. By October, the skin was thick as leather, scored with white scars where the limestone had cut her. Her weight dropped, 15 pounds by mid-September, 20 by October. Her collarbones jutted beneath her dress. Her cheeks went hollow. Britta watched her mother disappear into the work, shrinking even as the cellar grew. The injuries accumulated. A dropped stone crushed Marta's left thumbnail black. She lost the nail in early October and worked through the throbbing. A slip while hauling limestone opened a gash on her shin that took 3 weeks to heal. She wrapped it in cloth and kept walking. They ate what they could find. Rose hips gathered from the hillside, tart and tough, but packed with vitamins. Cattail roots dug from a creek bed a mile away. Choke cherries so bitter they made Britta's face twist. Cornmeal purchased in Townsend with some of their dwindling dollars stretched into thin mush that filled the stomach without satisfying it. The weather warned them. First frost on September 28th, thin ice on puddles, their breath visible in the morning air. Temperature 28 degrees. The ground hardened. Digging became slower, then stopped entirely. Everything that remained was above ground work. Snow flurries on October 15th. An inch of white that melted by afternoon, but left the message clear. Winter was coming. The race had entered its final stretch. The roof went up in 12 days. Marta salvaged every usable beam from the collapsed soddy. She cut poles from a deadfall stand along the creek, hauling them back across her shoulders like a draft animal. The frame was simple, a ridge beam running the 12-foot length of the cellar, supported by the limestone walls on the sides and the hillside at the back. Cross poles laid every 18 inches, lashed together with rope made from twisted grass. The covering took longer. Salvaged planks first, then a layer of birch bark stripped from deadfalls, then sod cut from the prairie with the shovel's edge, then earth from the spoil pile. 2 feet thick at the center, 3 feet at the edges. Heavy enough that Marta worried the frame would collapse before she finished. It held. She did not know why, but it held. The stove arrived by luck. A junk dealer from Helena passed through Townsend in late September, his wagon piled with salvage from abandoned homesteads and closed mines. Marta walked the 8 miles to meet him. She had $4 left. She spent $3 on a small cast-iron box stove, 18 inches long, 12 wide, 14 tall, dented, rusted at the edges, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. It would burn. That was all that mattered. The chimney she built herself. Creek-bottom clay, dug from the banks and hauled back in buckets. She formed it around wooden mandrels, straight branches stripped of bark, shaping tubes 18 inches long, 6 inches across. She dried them in the October sun, then fired them in a pit kiln, a hole in the ground filled with burning wood, the clay pipes stacked above the flames, baking for 2 days until they rang when struck. 12 pipes, 15 feet of chimney, 7 feet below grade, 8 feet above. She stacked them vertically through a hole cut in the roof, sealing the joints with lime mortar. Then she cut the ventilation. 1 4-inch hole at floor level near the entrance, 1 4-inch hole at ceiling level opposite the stove. The chimney would create draft, pulling fresh air in through the low vent, exhausting stale air through the high vent and up the flue. If she had calculated wrong, she would die of carbon monoxide poisoning. She would not even know it was happening. She would simply not wake up. She lit the first fire on October 25th and stood outside the entrance watching for smoke. Smoke rose from the chimney, clean, steady, no leaks. She went inside and breathed. On October 19th, the rain came. 2 days of steady downpour, heavy and cold. The last gasp of autumn before the snow took over. Water found its way into everything, through gaps in the roof, around the edges of the entrance, seeping up through the floor, where the drainage channel had not yet been completed. By midnight of the first day, 6 inches of water stood on the cellar floor. The lower courses of limestone sat submerged. Marta could hear the stone settling, grinding against itself as the water undermined the walls. She worked through the night, rain streaming down her face, mud up to her knees, digging a trench from the low corner of the cellar down the hillside. The ground was saturated. Every shovel of mud she removed filled with water almost immediately. But gradually, inch by inch, the trench deepened. Water began to flow. By dawn, the floor was draining. By noon, only puddles remained. Marta had not slept in 36 hours. Her hands shook. Her legs would not hold her weight. She sat down in the mud at the entrance to her cellar and watched the rain continue to fall. Britta brought her cornmeal mush, cold and thin. Marta ate it without tasting anything. 2 days lost. 2 days she could not afford. The setback felt like a death sentence. But the walls had held. The drainage worked, and the rain was stopping. She slept for 4 hours, then went back to work. Inja Baka returned in late October. She rode up to the cellar entrance carrying a bundle across her saddle. She dismounted without explanation and handed the bundle to Marta. Inside, half a smoked ham, wrapped in cloth, 20 pounds of potatoes, a wool blanket, thick and heavy, a cast-iron Dutch oven, blackened with years of use. "November has not arrived yet," Marta said. "I know," Inja replied. "I am paying off an old debt to your husband's people." There was no old debt. This was charity, plain and simple. Marta hesitated. Pride was a weight she could feel in her chest, the Norwegian stubbornness that said she should do this alone, should not accept help from strangers, should prove that she could survive without anyone. Pride was a luxury. Britta's life was not. Marta accepted the bundle. "The ham will keep until February if you hang it in the cold corner," Inja said. "The potatoes will last longer underground than they would in my cabin. The blanket is for the girl. The Dutch oven is for you. You are too thin." Marta did not argue. She was too thin. She knew it every time she cinched her dress tighter, every time she caught her reflection in standing water. Inja looked at the cellar entrance, at the smoke rising from the clay chimney, at Britta standing in the doorway watching them. "You might actually survive this," Inja said. It was the closest thing to a compliment she had offered. She mounted her horse and rode away. Marta carried the bundle inside. She hung the ham in the cold corner, where the temperature stayed around 40 degrees even when the stove was burning. She stored the potatoes in a nook she had carved into the limestone wall. She wrapped the blanket around Britta's shoulders. Then she started cooking. November 1st. The earth shelter was complete. The stove burned, the chimney vented. The ventilation system worked. Marta stood inside and looked at what she had built, 12 feet deep, 14 feet wide, 7 feet tall, limestone walls that glowed faintly in the firelight, pale stone veined with gold, the colors of the limestone hills themselves. A packed earth floor that she had smoothed with the flat of her shovel. A small wooden platform in one corner where she and Britta slept, raised above the floor to catch the rising warmth. The stove crackled. The temperature inside, without fire, had been 52 degrees. With the small fire burning, it climbed to 61. Warm enough, more than warm enough. Outside, the temperature was 28 degrees and dropping. Marta did the math one more time. Food stores, approximately 120 pounds of preserved and dried provisions. Enough for 6 weeks if they were careful. Short of the 5 months they needed, but a start. Firewood, 1.5 cords cut and stacked against the hillside near the entrance, in a surface cabin that would last perhaps 2 months. In the earth shelter, if her calculations were correct, it might last 4 or 5. Water. Snow could be melted. The creek was a mile away, but she had filled every container she owned. Everything depended on the earth now. Everything depended on whether the limestone walls and the surrounding soil would hold their warmth through the deepest cold Montana could deliver. Gunnar Holmvik had said she would freeze in that hole. Inge Backa had called it a grave. Orrin Thatcher had promised to scrape her bones out by spring. The hole was finished. The grave was built. Now Marta had to prove them all wrong. She added a log to the stove and watched the flames climb. Outside, the first real snow began to fall. But winter had not truly arrived yet. November proved the mathematics. On November 3rd, the temperature outside dropped to 22 degrees. Inside the earth shelter, without fire, the air held at 49 degrees. Marta pressed her palm against the limestone wall and felt the steady warmth bleeding through the stone. Heat that had been stored in the earth since summer, releasing slowly into the space she had carved. 27 degrees of difference, free, provided by nothing but the ground beneath her feet. She lit a small fire, let it burn for 2 hours, then banked it to embers. The temperature climbed to 64 degrees and held there through the night. Britta slept without shivering for the first time since October. By November 10th, outside temperatures had dropped to 12 degrees. Inside, without fire, 48 degrees. Inside, with a small fire burning, 64 degrees. The pattern held. The earth was keeping its promise. Marta began tracking firewood consumption. 1/8 of a cord per week with continuous small fires. At this rate, her 1.5 cords would last 12 weeks. Through mid-February, past the worst of winter. She would need more before spring, but not the impossible amounts a surface cabin demanded. The mathematics she had gambled everything on were working, but mathematics meant nothing to Gunnar Holmvik. He found her in mid-November, while checking what remained of his cattle range. The summer drought had left the grazing land thin. Early snow had buried what little grass survived. Holmvik was already culling weak animals, slaughtering them for meat before the cold killed them for nothing. His herd of 60 had dropped to 52. By spring, he expected half that. He had not intended to visit the Norwegian widow. He had written her off as dead in September, another casualty of immigrant stubbornness. But he saw smoke rising from the hillside where no cabin stood, and curiosity pulled him from his route. He found the entrance to the earth shelter, a low doorway framed with salvaged planks, half hidden by the slope of the hill. Smoke rose from a clay chimney 15 feet away. Snow had accumulated on the earthen roof, making the whole structure look like part of the landscape. Holmvik dismounted and approached the entrance. He called out, Marta appeared in the doorway. She looked thinner than he remembered, her cheeks hollowed by months of labor and short rations. But she was standing. She was alive. He asked if he could come inside. She stepped aside. Holmvik descended 3 steps into the earth shelter. The temperature change was immediate, a wall of warmth that pressed against his face like a hand. After weeks of cold, after endless hours in a cabin that never climbed above 40 degrees no matter how much wood he burned, the warmth felt impossible. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. Limestone walls glowing in the firelight, a small stove crackling in the corner. Britta sitting on a wooden platform, wrapped in a wool blanket, reading from a tattered book. The girl looked up. She recognized him, the man who had told her mother they would freeze. Holmvik did not speak for a long moment. He pressed his hand against the limestone wall, feeling the stored heat. He looked at the ventilation holes, the clay chimney, the careful construction. "This is madness," he said finally. "The earth holds warmth in autumn. It will not last." Marta asked what temperature he thought it was inside. Holmvik considered. 50 degrees, he guessed. Maybe 55. Marta told him it was 61. The stove had been burning for an hour. Without fire, it held at 48. Holmvik shook his head. "Wait until January. Wait until the real cold. Then we will see." He climbed back up the steps into the November air. The cold hit him like a slap. His cabin was 4 miles away, and he dreaded returning to it. But he did not believe. 11 winters had taught him what killed people. Underground holes were not the answer. They could not be. He mounted his horse and rode away. Marta watched him go. Then she returned to the warmth of the earth shelter and added another log to the fire. January would come, and when it did, she would have her answer. The warnings arrived in late November. Old-timers in Townsend compared the weather patterns to 1879, the year of the Great Freeze, the year Holmvik had lost his first wife and 2 sons. The signs were the same: drought summer, early snow, temperatures dropping faster than anyone could remember. Word spread through the mining camps and ranches. This winter would kill. The first blizzard struck on November 16th, winds above 40 miles per hour. Visibility 0. Temperature plummeted to minus 22 degrees in a matter of hours. Marta sealed the entrance with the wool blanket Inja had given her, stuffing the gaps with dried grass. She stoked the fire high and watched the temperature inside the shelter. It dropped from 61 degrees to 58. Then it held. Outside, minus 22. Inside, 58. 80 degrees of difference. The blizzard raged for 2 days. When it passed, Marta dug out the entrance and looked at the world the storm had left behind. Snowdrifts 6 feet high, trees stripped of branches, the silence that comes after violence. She checked her firewood supply. She had burned more than usual, nearly a quarter cord in 2 days. But the shelter had held. The earth had held. The brief warming came in late November, a week of temperatures in the 20s that felt like spring after the blizzard. Marta used the break to cut and haul more firewood, another half cord, dragged from the deadfall stand along the creek. Her arms ached, her back screamed. But the woodpile grew. Britta asked if winter was over. Marta said no. The worst was coming. She did not know how right she was. January arrived like a door slamming shut. The month began cold and grew colder. Temperatures that had hovered near 0 dropped to minus 10, then minus 20. The snow compacted into ice. The world turned white and still and deadly. On January 8th, Britta developed a cough. Marta noticed it first in the morning, a wet, rattling sound that came from deep in her daughter's chest. By afternoon, Britta's forehead was hot to the touch. By evening, she could barely keep down water. Fever, a bad one. Marta had no medicine. The nearest doctor was in Townsend, 8 miles away, and Britta could not travel. Even if she could, the doctor could do little. Frontier medicine was prayer and patience and hope that the body would heal itself. Marta wrapped Britta in every blanket she had. She kept the fire burning high. She melted snow for water and made Britta drink sip by sip, fighting the fever's dehydration. She did not sleep that night. She sat beside her daughter and watched her breathe. The cough worsened, the fever climbed, and then the blizzard came. January 9th, 1887. Temperature at dawn, 18 degrees above zero. Warmer than it had been in weeks, deceptively warm. By noon, snow began falling. Not gently, the flakes came sideways, driven by winds that built from nothing to howling in less than an hour. 16 inches fell in 16 hours. The world outside the shelter entrance disappeared into a wall of white. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to minus 22 degrees. Marta sealed the entrance. She could not go outside now, even if she wanted to. The blizzard would kill in minutes. Wind chill cold enough to freeze exposed skin in seconds. Visibility so poor she could lose the shelter entrance 10 feet away. She was trapped. Britta was sick, and the temperature was still falling. By January 10th, it reached minus 38 degrees. By January 11th, minus 42. By January 12th, the mercury in the thermometer Marta had brought from Elkhorn vanished into the bulb. Minus 46 degrees at least, possibly colder. The blizzard continued. Winds screamed across the limestone hills, piling snow against the south-facing slope, burying the earth shelter deeper with every hour. The entrance became a tunnel, then a cave, then a dark passage that Marta had to clear with her shovel just to reach fresh air. Inside, she kept the fire burning. Temperature on January 10th, 54 degrees with continuous fire. The limestone walls absorbed heat from the stove and radiated it slowly back into the room. Even when the fire died to embers, the temperature dropped only a few degrees per hour. The earth surrounded them, 3 feet of soil and stone on every side, holding the warmth like a living thing. Britta's fever peaked on January 11th. She was delirious, calling for her father, not recognizing Marta's face. Her skin burned. Her breathing came shallow and fast. The cough had turned into something worse, a wet gurgling sound that spoke of fluid in her lungs. Marta could do nothing but keep her warm and keep her hydrated. If Britta died, she would die warm. That was all Marta could offer. She did not sleep for 3 days. She sat beside her daughter, feeding the fire, melting snow, spooning water between cracked lips. The world outside could have ended and she would not have noticed. Nothing existed except Britta's breathing and the temperature on the shelter walls. Jasaninam. On January 12th, Marta let the fire die deliberately. She needed to know. She needed to understand exactly what the earth was providing, not what she hoped it provided, but the truth. If Britta was going to survive, Marta needed to know how much margin she had. The fire died to embers at midnight. Marta watched the temperature. 1 hour, 56 degrees. 2 hours, 54 degrees. 3 hours, 52 degrees. 4 hours, 51 degrees. 5 degrees in 4 hours. 1¼ degrees per hour. At that rate, without fire, the shelter would take nearly 20 hours to drop to freezing, and it would never reach freezing because the earth itself would stabilize the temperature somewhere in the mid-40s. Outside, minus 46 degrees. Inside, 51 degrees without fire. 97 degrees of difference, provided free by the earth. Marta built the fire back up. The temperature climbed to 58, then 60, then 62. The limestone walls absorbed the heat and held it, releasing slowly, steadily, like a heartbeat. Britta's fever did not break that night, but it did not climb either. She was holding. The earth was holding. 4 miles away, Gunnar Holmvik was burning his furniture. His cabin was well built, 16 by 20 feet, hewn logs chinked with mud and straw, a good iron stove with a proper chimney. He had built it himself in 1874, after the cabin where his first family died. He had made it strong, but strong meant nothing when the temperature dropped to 46 below. The wind found every gap. Cold seeped through the walls like water through cloth. No matter how high he stoked the fire, the temperature inside never climbed above 38 degrees. His water bucket froze. His breath crystallized in the air. He had burned half a cord of firewood in the first week of January. By January 15th, he was breaking apart chairs. By January 20th, he would start on the chicken coop. The chickens were already dead anyway, frozen in a pile of feathers and ice. His cattle were dying. He had lost 42 of his 60 head in the first week of January alone. The animals froze standing, too weak to lie down. He found them in the morning like statues, ice in their nostrils, their eyes open and white. This was the winter that would end open-range ranching in Montana. This was the winter that would kill more cattle than any before or since. The Great Die-Up, they would call it later, when the bodies were counted, when the rivers ran brown with rotting carcasses, when the math was done. Holmvik did not know the name yet. He only knew he was cold and getting colder and running out of things to burn. He thought about the Norwegian widow in her underground hole. He wondered if she was dead yet. He hoped she was not. But he did not believe she could be alive. 5 miles east, the Jensen family was not burning furniture. They had nothing left to burn. The Jensens were Swedish immigrants, a husband, a wife, 3 children. They had arrived in Montana in 1885 with high hopes and thin resources. Their cabin was small, poorly chinked, built in a hurry before their first winter. They had survived 1885 through luck and charity. They had not improved the cabin since. Now the wind came through the walls like they were not there. The temperature inside hovered at 22 degrees with the fire burning. When the fire died, it dropped to 10. The youngest Jensen child was 4 years old, a boy named Anders. He had been sick since Christmas, a cough that would not go away, a fever that came and went. On January 14th, the fever returned. Anders could not keep food down. His breathing grew ragged. His parents wrapped him in every blanket they had. They kept the fire burning. They prayed. At 3 in the morning on January 15th, Anders stopped breathing. The ground was frozen solid, 6 feet down at least, maybe more. They could not dig a grave. They wrapped their son's body in his blanket and set him outside the cabin, where the cold would preserve him until spring. Mrs. Jensen did not stop crying for 3 days. Mr. Jensen did not speak at all. Anders Jensen was 4 years old when he died. He was one of at least 235 people who froze to death in the northern plains that January. Most of them were children. On January the 16th, Britta's fever broke. Marta had fallen asleep sitting up, exhausted beyond endurance. She woke to a small hand touching her face. Britta was looking at her, clear-eyed, alert. The fever flush was gone from her cheeks. "I am hungry," Britta said. Marta did not move for a moment. She was afraid that if she moved, this would prove to be a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. But Britta was still there, still asking for food. Marta stood. Her legs nearly gave out. She had barely eaten in days, too focused on her daughter to remember her own body. She steadied herself against the limestone wall, feeling the stored warmth against her palm. She cut a slice of ham from Inge's gift. She boiled water and made thin broth. She fed Britta slowly, watching her daughter eat, watching the color return to her face. The temperature outside was minus 31 degrees. The blizzard had passed, leaving drifts 8 feet high around the shelter entrance. The world was white and frozen and merciless. Inside, the earth shelter held 60 degrees with the fire burning, 60 degrees, and a daughter who was going to live. Marta sat down beside Britta and let herself cry for the first time since this had begun. Not from grief, not from fear, from relief so profound it felt like drowning. The earth had held. Britta had held. They were going to survive. For 16 days, the temperature never rose above minus 20 degrees. Most days it hovered between minus 30 and minus 45. The cold was so profound that trees exploded in the night, their sap freezing and expanding until the trunks split with sounds like rifle shots. The Cree called January the moon of cold exploding trees. That year, the name was literal. Inside the earth shelter, Marta and Britta waited. Firewood consumption climbed higher than Marta had planned, nearly a quarter cord per week during the worst of it, the fire burning continuously to keep the temperature above 55 degrees. But even at that rate, she had enough. The supply that would have lasted 2 months in a surface cabin stretched to 4 in the earth shelter. The food held. The smoked ham from Inja was down to scraps, but the potatoes remained, and the dried corn and the rose hips Britta had gathered in autumn. They ate thin soups and cornmeal mush. They stayed warm. Britta recovered. The cough lingered, but the fever did not return. By late January, she was helping her mother clear the entrance tunnel, hauling buckets of snow up and out, and then the cold began to lift. On January 28th, the temperature climbed to minus 8 degrees. It felt like summer. Marta stood at the entrance of the earth shelter and turned her face toward the sun, weak and pale, but present. The sun was returning. The worst was over. Gunnar came first. In late January, a brief warming allowed travel. Holmvik had heard from a passing rider that smoke still rose from the hillside where the Norwegian widow had dug her hole. He did not believe it, but he needed to see. He found the entrance half buried in snow, a narrow tunnel leading down into the earth. He called out. Marta's voice answered, inviting him inside. He descended. The warmth hit him like a physical force. After weeks of cold, endless, bone-deep cold that he had almost forgotten was not the normal state of existence, the warmth felt miraculous, impossible, like stepping into a different world. The shelter was dim, lit by the glow of the stove and a single tallow candle. Marta stood near the entrance, thinner than he remembered but alive. Britta sat on the sleeping platform, reading from the same tattered book. Holmvik pressed his hand against the limestone wall. Warm. Not hot. Not cold. Steady. He asked what temperature it was inside. Marta told him 54 degrees, 12 below zero outside. The fire had been burning for an hour. Holmvik turned slowly, taking in the construction, the dry stacked walls, the clay chimney disappearing through the earthen roof, the ventilation holes, the careful, deliberate design. He had survived 11 Montana winters. He had built 4 cabins with his own hands. He knew what killed people in cold. This should not have worked. Everything he knew said this should not have worked, but it had. He looked at Marta. She waited. I told you that you would freeze in this hole, he said. I was wrong. The words came hard. Holmvik was not a man who admitted error easily. He had buried too many people to be uncertain about death. But the evidence was standing in front of him, alive, warm. I have buried my first wife and 2 sons to the cold, he continued. I have built 4 cabins. I know what kills people in winter. He paused. He looked around the shelter again. This is not a hole, he said. This is something else. He asked Marta to explain how it worked. She did. The Earth's constant temperature, the limestone thermal mass, the reduced heating requirement, the ventilation system. She drew diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick. She answered his questions. Holmvik listened. When she finished, he folded the scrap of paper where he had taken notes and tucked it into his coat. I will return in spring, he said. I want to see how you built the chimney. Then he climbed back up into the cold and rode away. Inga Baka came next, in early February. She had struggled through the winter in her surface cabin. She was alive, but the cost was visible, weight lost, face gaunt, the look of someone who had not been warm in months. She had burned most of her furniture. Her last milk cow had died in the blizzard. She descended into the earth shelter and stood in the warmth for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, You did it. Marta said she had. I gave you the ham early because I did not believe you would live this long, Ina continued. I wanted you to have it before you died. Marta said she was grateful either way. Inja looked around the shelter, at the limestone walls steady and solid, at the small stove radiating heat far beyond its size, at Britta, healthy and reading her book. I was wrong about the grave, Inga said. This is not a grave. This is the opposite of a grave. She asked Marta to explain the construction. Marta did, the same explanation she had given Holmvik, the same diagrams drawn in the dirt. Inga asked different questions. How did you seal the chimney joints? How deep is the drainage channel? How much lime did you burn for the mortar? She was already planning. By spring, she would dig. Before she left, Inga told Marta about the Jensen boy, Anders, 4 years old, frozen on January 15th. His body was still lying outside his parents' cabin, waiting for the ground to thaw. Marta did not speak. She thought about Britta's fever, about the 3 days she had not slept, about how close they had come. 58 degrees. That was the margin. 58 degrees between her daughter and Anders Jensen. She thanked Ingi for telling her. Inga rode away. Others followed. The Lutheran minister from Townsend arrived in mid-February to confirm the widow and child were alive. He descended into the shelter, felt the warmth, and left having seen something he could not explain by faith alone. 3 homesteaders from the Townsend area visited after hearing rumors about the underground dwelling. All 3 left with plans to dig their own. 2 of them came back with questions about limestone quarrying and clay pipe firing. One of Gunnar Holmvik's surviving ranch hands sought Marta out to ask about the chimney design. His wife was pregnant, and he wanted something better than the surface cabin where they had nearly frozen. Marta turned no one away. She explained everything, the principles, the techniques, the measurements, the materials. She drew diagrams in the dirt and then in charcoal on scraps of paper. She showed visitors the limestone walls, the clay pipe chimney, the ventilation system, the drainage channel. She did not ask for payment. She did not claim ownership of the idea. When someone suggested she could sell the method, she shook her head. The earth does not belong to me, she said. I only learned what it offers. The earth offered its warmth to anyone desperate enough to dig for it. Marta saw no reason to charge for something the ground gave freely. Orrin Thatcher came last, late February, when travel became reliable again. He rode out from Elkhorn alone, without the surveyor this time. He had expected to find corpses. He had hoped to find corpses, evidence that his prediction had been correct, that the Norwegian widow had gotten what she deserved for defying him. Instead, he found smoke rising from the hillside. He found a cleared entrance tunnel. He found Marta Kjellstad standing at the top of the path, waiting for him as if she had known he would come. She had known. Of course he would come. Thatcher dismounted but did not descend into the shelter. He stood at the entrance and looked down at the warm glow from below. Britta appeared in the doorway. She looked at Thatcher with her father's pale eyes. She did not speak. Marta reached into her coat and produced a folded document, a homestead claim, filed in Townsend in January. The land around the abandoned property, 160 acres, including the limestone hills slope and the root cellar site. She handed it to Thatcher. He read it. His thin mouth went thinner. "The company will dispute this claim," he said. "They may try," Marta replied. "But I have improved the land. I have witnesses. And I am alive." Thatcher looked at the claim, looked at the shelter, looked at Britta. He said nothing more. He folded the document, handed it back to Marta, and mounted his horse. The company never disputed the claim. By spring, Thatcher had been transferred to a mine in Butte. He never returned to the limestone hills. Marta watched him ride away. Then she returned to the warmth of the earth shelter and added another log to the fire. The winter was ending, and she was still here. By spring of 1887, Marta had explained her method to 14 homesteaders in the Townsend area. 7 of them began digging that summer. By winter of 1887 through 88, 4 completed earth shelters stood in the limestone hills, all based on Marta's design. Marta charged nothing for her guidance. She walked to each site, inspected the limestone, advised on drainage, demonstrated the clay pipe chimney technique. When asked why she shared freely, she said the earth had saved her daughter, and she owed it no less than everything. Marta Kjellstad proved her homestead claim in 1889, the year Montana became a state. She lived in the earth shelter until 1891, when she built a small frame house over the entrance, using the underground room as a root cellar and storm refuge. In 1893, she remarried a widower named Halvor Strand, a Norwegian stone mason who had come to examine her limestone walls and stayed. They raised Britta together, along with 2 more children born after the marriage. Marta died in 1921, at the age of 67. She was buried in the Townsend Cemetery, in ground she had learned to trust. On January 9th, 1887, the temperature in central Montana dropped 50 degrees in 4 hours. By midnight, mercury had fallen to 38 below zero. By week's end, it had vanished into the bulb. Gunnar Holmvik had said it plainly. "You will freeze in that hole, and you will take your daughter with you." He was 97 degrees wrong. That was the margin the earth provided, the gap between a surface cabin shaking in the wind at 46 below and an underground room holding steady at 51 above. One temperature froze cattle standing. The other kept a 9-year-old girl alive through fever and storm. The earth does not ask who you are. It does not care who threw you out. It holds the same warmth for widow and rancher, Norwegian and American, debtor and creditor. Marta Kjellstad dug into the limestone hills with bleeding hands and a daughter she refused to lose. The earth answered,